Thank you for coming to the first event sponsored by the Tocqueville Lecture Series this year. My name is Aurelian Crăiuțu, and I'm delighted to welcome today Damon Linker, who is a senior correspondent at TheWeek.com and a consulting editor at University of Pennsylvania Press. Damon is a political theorist who earned his PhD from Michigan State University, and he went on to taste the delights of being a journalist and an author as well. He is the author of two books, The Theocons, Secular America Under Siege, and The Religious Test, Why We Must Question the Beliefs of Our Leaders. Damon published essays in the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and he also edited the First Things magazine, and he worked as speechwriter for Mayor Rudy Giuliani and taught political philosophy for a while at Brigham Young University. Damon is here today to talk about the task of thinking in an age of reaction, and I'd like to add a personal note to this rather impersonal introduction. It's been a great honor and pleasure to work with Damon on my last book, and I'm delighted that we brought out a book that has been relevant to contemporary debates. And it is in this spirit that I invited Damon to share with us his experience as both a journalist as well as a public intellectual and an editor, which I think is very helpful for some of us who want to reach out to a wider audience than a merely academic one. Without further ado, I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Damon today.
Thank you very much, Aurelian, Professor Crăiuțu, for the introduction and for the invitation to be here today. It's my pleasure. This is going to be a strange talk. I mean, I do wear many hats, and that's not only because I don't have a lot of hair. I started out as an academic, taught for a while, then switched over into journalism, did some speech writing, as you heard. That was before Mayor Giuliani went a little crazy. And then ended up as a magazine editor, wrote books, taught writing at Penn, and now both write 3 columns a week, have done that for almost 4 years, and acquire academic books for the University of Pennsylvania Press. So it's a lot of different things. So what can a guy with that kind of a motley background have to offer by way of wisdom? Well, I'll do my best. We live, I think, in a reactionary age. And by saying that, I don't mean it in the sense that we use the term reactionary as opposed to, say, progressive. So, ever since the French Revolution, the left has defined itself as a kind of leading edge of progress. So it presumes that history is unfolding in a certain direction over time, leading to greater equality, greater recognition of rights for ever more people, more freedom for greater numbers of people over time. And in that unfolding, there are moments where certain segments of these modern societies react against that and try to either stop the progress or reverse it. That's the notion of reaction that is often used in our kind of civic discourse. And there is some truth to saying that we're in a reactionary age in that sense, but I don't want to talk about it in that way. What I mean is that we live in an age in which reacting to events is prized. And there are all kinds of ways in which this is the case that I'll be talking about over the next half hour, 45 minutes or so. It's the tendency of people who observe the political scene to think by way of reacting to provocation. And it's built into all kinds of aspects of our public lives. It's built into the structure of the media. Punditry, for instance, one of the things that I do, kind of pontificating on, reacting to the news, is set up in such a way as to encourage intense, strong reactions. Why is that? Well, people are busy, they're flooded with information, and people are often provoked to read something by reading a provocative headline. I mean, why would you read, all of the stuff that hits you when you go online? It's the headline provokes you in some way. Either that makes me so angry at the people that I hate, or it so feeds what I'm sure is true that I want to get extra ammunition from it. So you click, and then the media platform that put out that article gets your click as, in the pile that it gets to then use to show to advertisers that it has a lot of traffic. So there's that aspect to it. There's the way that social media in particular it kind of gives extra ammunition to and amplification to that prior tendency, especially on Twitter, where I spend a lot of my days. Twitter for a journalist today is kind of like a kind of teletype machine would have been half a century ago, a kind of constant stream of news, at least if you follow journalists. So I'm a journalist, and most of the people I follow are journalists, and we're all on Twitter all the time if we're sitting at our desks. And one thing today you even have the president himself who will tweet, and so you'll get a retweet of what Donald Trump has tweeted, but much more often than that you just get some breaking news story, the Washington Post or CNN or the New York Times, and it gets retweeted by everybody, and while it's retweeted, everybody comments on the actual link to the story. And so you see memes develop in real time. It was one of the most instructive times of the last few years. Anytime there was a presidential or primary debate during this last presidential cycle, that I would watch the debate while having Twitter on my laptop. And so I would be listening and watching the conventional wisdom about what was happening on the debate in real time on Twitter, as I saw journalists reacting to what was being said and then responding to each other, making little jokes and interpretations about what was happening. Sometimes a clever little line would then end up becoming how it got framed in the New York Times the next morning. So you get to watch that. But all of this is forms of reaction. We're all reacting to everything else that we see around us. And then on top of these kind of structural things, you see just the very fact that we have a 24/7 news cycle now. When I wake up in the morning, I look at my phone, and the first app I open is Twitter to see what I missed over the past 7 hours. And I would say most of the time there's something. Something happened, some story was posted at 4 a.m. from some outlet, or Trump tweeted something at 3 a.m. and people have been reacting to it for 4 hours already. So it's just a very complicated and intense hothouse trying to cover the news these days, all of it based on reacting to everything else. Now, one way to handle this, if you're trying to get your bearings and understand the political scene, is to treat it sort of like playing racquetball. So a provocation comes my way in the form of a news event, and then I bat it back instantly from the standpoint of my own political convictions, my own point of view, my settled ideological convictions. I hit it back with my own little spin on it, and then it bounces and it goes to someone else who then they throw it back, and it just goes on and on. And a lot of pundits, some very good ones, are extremely good at this kind of punditry. Paul Krugman at the New York Times, for example, is excellent at this. He says, this is no criticism of him per se, but he writes pretty much the same column every time. It's always a viciously angry attack on the right, no matter what's going on at the moment. In the early 2000s, it was about Bush and the Iraq War and tax cuts, and then Obama was in power, and it was about what the Congress was doing to scuttle the Obama agenda. And now it's all about Trump and how terrible the Republicans are. And so even aside from where you come down, if you agree with him about all of that, it is true that his columns are always reactive to whatever the provocation of the moment is within those settled convictions of Paul Krugman. Jonathan Chait is another center-left writer at New York Magazine who I think is very, very good at this. I admire him enormously. He's very articulate. He knows his stuff. He has policy chops on a whole lot of issues. But his punditry is also very reactive in the sense that he He usually writes his columns or blog posts for New York Magazine, however you want to call them that. There's a blending of those two things these days. His columns are usually a response to the latest thing happening among Republicans. So it's a criticism. So like the last week, well, of course, what has he been talking about? About the new Graham Cassidy bill to, the 18th time that the Republicans are going to try to get rid of Obamacare and replace it with some new alternative. Chait knows a fair amount about health care policy. He was a huge fan of Obama. And so he's animated about this, and he's reacting to what he sees. On the center right, you see examples of this as well all over the place. At National Review, they have a number of talented pundits who do this kind of thing regularly. So it's pervasive. In my own writing, though, in my own punditry, I strive to do more than react. Now, do I fail? Yeah, a fair number of times. I write 3 of these a week. That's 150 columns a year, which means that when I come up on my 4th anniversary this coming January, that will be roughly 600 columns written in 4 years. Each is approximately 1,000 words. So I've written about 600,000 words in 4 years. That's the length of 6 substantial books. Now, it's much easier to write like I do than to write 6 substantial books. No one could do that. But it's true that it's an enormous amount. And because of that, I slip, I fall, I say stupid things that I regret. I do a column every December in which I talk about the biggest mistakes I've made over the past year and point to those columns and explain how it happened, why I think I made my mistake. And I think that's an important exercise that more pundits should do, frankly, because we get a lot wrong. Bill Kristol could write a large tome about how wrong he was about the Iraq War, if only he'd acknowledged that he was wrong about the Iraq War. But in doing this, I use 3 thinkers as a kind of model or ideal. Now, I'm going to sound kind of pretentious in saying this, and I want you to know that I don't literally mean that I, think that I approach these figures because they outrank me by a factor of about 1 billion. But my models basically are Aristotle, Thucydides, and Alexis de Tocqueville in this limited sense. Aristotle, the great ancient Greek philosopher, talked in his treatise on politics about the role of the umpire, that somehow the political philosopher who tries to understand what politics is all about needs to act like an umpire, and in our time, think of baseball umpires or ref, someone who is in the game, on the field, but is supposed to be an impartial judge of what's going on, is not supposed to have a stake in which side, which team wins, or which team is playing dirty. The umpire is supposed to simply judge what's going on in the field for the sake of making fair play for everyone involved. Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian of the epical Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, he spoke in the early pages of his great history of the Peloponnesian War about his book being a possession for all time. Now, let me just tell you, I have no illusions. No pundit is writing as a possession for all time. Punditry is so ephemeral that if I reread a column I've written a year later and I don't laugh, it's a huge achievement. Reading punditry from, 50 years ago is ridiculous. I mean, the fact is that it's commenting on events that get forgotten very, very quickly. So this is not something I don't really strive to write for all time. However, I do try as much as I can to write thinking to myself, how will this read 6 months, a year, 10 years from now? Am I likely to be embarrassed by this rather than it just being, well, of course, I don't care about what you're talking about because we care about other things now. That's normal. But is this going to be something that I'm going to roll my eyes? Like, how could I have thought that? And I try as best I can to avoid that. I'll talk in a little bit about how I try to do these things. Finally, Tocqueville talked in his great book about how he tried in Democracy in America to see further than the engaged political parties of his time, factions of his time. in the early 19th century. In the U.S., but also in his native France, which at the time he was writing was still coping with the bloody aftermath and instability of the French Revolution. Tocqueville spoke in the preface to his great book about feeling in the grips of an almost religious terror about what would happen in a world in which the principle of equality was applied ever more rigorously and leveled every hierarchy that was received. But unlike those in his time who were more like reactionaries in the original sense that I meant, who kind of took up arms against the spread of natural rights in the aftermath of the French Revolution, Tocqueville had a different aim, which was to try to make the most of it, to try to make the best of it, to take the most dangerous aspects of the post-revolutionary order and to tame them, to moderate them, to try to make them as worthwhile and civically positive as he could. And his analysis in the 2 volumes of Democracy in America are his contribution to doing that. That book was written, so that great, we as Americans can read it almost 200 years later and think, wow, this guy saw a lot of stuff. It's amazing that he could do that. But it was mainly written for his fellow Frenchmen, to give them a lesson about one way in which equality could be instantiated in a place, in institutions, in a way that might be more positive than the way it was unfolding in France itself, with the violence and instability of the French Revolution. So my point is that I strive as much as I can in my commentary to rise above the fray, to be fair to all sides, to avoid easy partisan point scoring, to rein in or at least discipline my own tendency to react as a partisan. There's nothing shameful about partisanship at all, but there's a key to the word. The key to the word is part. A partisan stands for one part's view of the whole. It's what one faction thinks is for the best, for the common good, whereas what I at least strive to do is to keep in my mind at all times what is going on with the whole without the part involved. In other words, I want my account of the whole in what I write to take account of all parts, both the part that when I vote I find myself affiliated with, but also the parts that I can't stand when I'm in the voting booth and I think are really bad for the whole. But to understand the whole, not to act as a political actor, but to think, to understand what's going on, one needs to take account of all those parts. So that means that however much I write, and I've written plenty of them, believe me, things critical of Trump over the last 2 years, lots of them, a flood of them, I always try to mix them up with other pieces that are less harsh, because the fact is I don't like Trump very much. I'll talk more about that in a couple minutes about why. But I also understand that if we as Americans who care about the common good, about what's good for the country as a whole, we have to understand how the hell this happened. Where did this guy come from? Who is this? Why did he win? Why does more than a third of the country like what he does, no matter what he does, no matter how outrageous it might seem to me as someone who tends to vote at this point in my life for Democrats? And so that means that I try to grasp that in thought as much as I can. Again, I often fail. It's inevitable with deadline pressures, with reading that Twitter feed and all of the provocations that are constantly coming my way because of my own partisan commitments, my own volatile emotions that are a product of my makeup psychologically, my tendency toward anger, which is just true all around, and it definitely fastens onto politics a lot of the times. So I'm easily provoked to reaction. But at my best, my columns express an outlook and sensibility that is informed by more than reaction. That's especially challenging in the Trump era when our politics is becoming ever more polarized and when negative partisanship is rampant. So now I want to talk a little bit about what these two things are. They're related, but they're also somewhat distinct. So polarization. In the middle decades of the 20th century, the two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, ideologically overlapped a lot. They didn't agree about everything. There were certain tendencies in each, and that was because each party was made up of different factions, and the cleavages or the separations between those factions had different kind of dimensions to them. So, you know, the Democrats tended to be a coalition, a very unstable coalition between Southern white, kind of Jim Crow supporting racists, frankly. They were a big part of the Democratic Party. But then you also had the New Deal coalition of kind of working class, union belonging workers in northern cities. You also had that part of the party. And then once we got into the early 60s, you started to get a new faction of what we today think of as, like, you know, coastal elites who are in favor of the civil rights movement and everything that came out of that. It turned out that that coalition proved to be too unstable. But back to around the middle of the century, the Republicans were different. The Republicans, you had some factions of kind of further right-wing populism, the kind of people who voted for Goldwater in 1964, but you also had a lot of northeastern wealthy people who were actually very different than those, than the kind of populist types. For instance, in the 1960s, the early 60s, the kind of Rockefeller Republicans in New York kind of ran the state. They were liberal Republicans, actually quite liberal by today's standards, unthinkably liberal for a Republican. And so that coalition too was quite unstable. And so what ended up happening is, to make a complicated story short, with the rise of the civil rights movement and that faction taking over the Democratic Party through the opposition to the Vietnam War, as well as the civil rights movement, the rise of the counterculture in the late 60s, by 1972, where you got a nominee of George McGovern, who was the most left-wing person to get a major party nomination in quite a long time, if not ever. He took over, and by that point, the Southern, more conservative opposition to the civil rights movement, the kind of the post Jim Crow South, began to peel off. And at the same time, Nixon, who was at that point president on the Republican side, started to deliberately try to appeal to people who were disaffected in the South by the civil rights movement. You also had George Wallace in there, who was a kind of catalyst for that breaking off of the South from the Democratic Party. But over the next subsequent several decades, you have a story where you have a kind of realignment of the parties. Reagan was an important part of that because Reagan kind of put a new coalition together for the Republicans, where you had those Goldwater types, kind of very populist right-wing Republicans, combining with a jettisoning of the northeastern Rockefeller Republicans and adding on the South, the kind of post Jim Crow South, people who were very angry about a lot of the federal intervention in the South that led to the shattering of Jim Crow there. And so that was the Republican Party starting in 1980, whereas the Democrats then, had their own change. They had to make up for the fact that they lost a lot of voters by losing the South, and that's one of the reasons why they lost in 1980 and 1984 and 1988. It was only in 1992 that the Democrats kind of had a new stability by the New Democrats, Bill Clinton taking over as a kind of more centrist Democrat who can appeal to some of the working class white voters who had always voted for Democrats but kind of drifted to Reagan, became the Reagan Democrats when Reagan ran. And so for the last couple of decades, you've had that as the new alignment. But at the same time, you've also had a kind of ideological sorting going on, so that the Democrats have slowly evolved into a more purely left-wing party at the grassroots, whereas the Republicans have evolved into a more purely right-wing party. With every election, each group becoming a little bit further to its own extreme. The Republicans moving to the right, the Democrats moving to the left. The Democrats were the second to do that. Obama was a kind of bridge figure, I think. The point is that by today, what you have is Donald Trump, who is several clicks to the right of George W. Bush, who was himself several clicks to the right from his father, who was kind of trying to play along with Reagan, not that convincingly. But the point is that with each presidential nominee, there's a movement to the right. And Trump is so far to the right that he almost doesn't even fit on left-right on everything. And I'll get to that in a moment as well. On the left, with Bernie Sanders' challenge to Hillary Clinton that did remarkably well, you see a kind of upsurge of a kind of left-wing challenge to the status quo there. And as you often, if you've been paying attention to the news, within the last few weeks, Bernie Sanders has proposed a single-payer health care bill in Congress that has now been signed on to by every major person who's going to be running for president among the Democrats in 2020. And next week, on Monday, there's going to be a CNN debate between Graham and Cassidy, the Republicans who want to repeal Obamacare, and Bernie Sanders, who's going to be defending a single-payer health care system as the alternative to that. This is scaring the crap out of centrist Democrats because they think, like, oh my goodness, now our party stands for single-payer. That's too far to the left. We're going to get killed in the general elections that we face coming up. So all very interesting stuff. The point is that the political system is kind of polarizing, that you're getting. When I was in graduate school, you learned about American electoral politics according to a bell curve where you have basically you have the left and you have the far right, and both of them are kind of really tiny. They're at the tails of the distribution. And as you move toward the center, you have more and more voters, more and more voters. And according to that theory, normally you have a primary, and in the presidential primary, you're running only with Democrats if you're a Democrat. If you're a Republican, you're running only with Republicans. And so you're kind of fighting over which candidate will be the person who most accurately represents what people in that party want. But then once you choose your candidate in the general election, the two candidates move ever more toward the center and position themselves as the center so they can get the most votes, because that's where the most votes are. So the more centrist you are, the more you win. This has been collapsing, I think, for a long time, but especially since George W. Bush's reelection in 2004. 2004, he ran as a kind of right-wing Republican, appealing to evangelical Christians very strongly. My first book comes out of that election and the consequences of it and what it said about the country at the time. But Trump blew this out of the water. Trump, ran entirely toward not just the Republican Party, but toward his right-wing faction of the Republican Party. And if someone like Bernie Sanders ends up the nominee in 2020, the same thing is going to happen on the left, I think. And then that means that the bell curve with most voters in the middle and then few on the ends is sort of splitting, where the middle is kind of hollowing out and you're getting what's called a bimodal distribution, where there are a lot of voters on the right and a lot of voters on the left. And in the middle is kind of the empty set, where neither of them are. That's dangerous. It's politically dangerous because our political system is a winner-take-all system. It means that we're likely to be developing a political system that is going to have a lot of this kind of reaction that I mentioned, where you're going to end up with Trump becoming president with only 46% of the vote. That's quite a bit less than a majority, but he gets 100% of the power, right? And then you have the weirdness that I won't get into with the Electoral College, that actually Clinton got a lot more than that, but even she was less than 50%. What if we end up with a third party who runs in 2020, and that the third party, say a center-left candidate like Mark Zuckerberg, decides he's going to run for president, which I think is likely? Then you would get Mark Zuckerberg splitting the vote with a left candidate, like a kind of maybe Kamala Harris, who runs a Bernie Sanders-style campaign on the left. They split the center-left and left vote, and Trump wins with 40% of the vote. That could definitely happen. I don't know if it will, but it could. And if it happens, then he only has 40% of the vote, and he has 100% of the power. How angry do you think that would make the left? And what would they want to do the next time? How angry of a leftist would want to run the next time? So it's volatile. Our system isn't well built to withstand that. But the question I want to raise about polarization is, how is it that Donald Trump could win with as right-wing as he was? How did he manage to do it? Again, bracketing the Electoral College weirdness. Let's assume he just won whatever. He won. How did he do it? Well, polarization is aided and abetted in our system by something else called negative partisanship. So Trump appealed to, I don't know, we don't know exactly, 25 to 35% of the electorate. That's not all. The Republicans are more than that. So it's not all Republicans. A lot of Republicans hated him. They thought he was disgusting. He's not a conservative. He's a kind of scummy reality show guy who had this terrible, behavior. He's vulgar. All kinds of reasons they didn't like him. They don't like him on policy. Didn't have the temperament to be president. And yet he got 46% of the vote. He did that because some Republicans loved him. That's how he got the nomination. And the rest said, I hate Trump, but I hate Clinton more. I hate Clinton more, so I'll vote for him. Now, I didn't think that would happen. Why? Because I didn't like Clinton either. But the thought of thinking that I would rather have Trump over her was insane, because at least she was competent, intelligent, informed. I wouldn't worry that she would call the head of North Korea Rocket Man and talk about annihilating it. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which I thought, well, even if I'm not a huge fan of Hillary Clinton, at least I won't have trouble sleeping while she's president. She at least is qualified to be president. She's prepared to be it, has as much experience as anyone who's run for president. She was Secretary of State. She was First Lady for 8 years. She did all these things. She has all these accomplishments in her life that showed that she knew what she was doing. And that should be a kind of base for whoever you vote for president. But a lot of Republicans hated her more than they hated Trump. And that happens on both sides, negative partisanship. It's a kind of poison to, I think, stable, good government. And we're living through it these days. We have a whole media infrastructure that exists to encourage this. A lot of people on the center left and left who I follow on Twitter are totally negative partisans about the Republican Party. Whether they like Clinton or like Sanders or the left or the center left, they hate the Republicans. They despise the Republicans. Everything Trump does, they just go crazy about. Oh my God, the Republicans, psychopathic party, totally over the top in their rhetoric describing it. And it happens on both sides. And this is happening more and more. And the danger of this is that it allows the parties and their candidates to not even have to have a coherent, positive vision at all. All they can say is, well, at least I'm not them. We can't let them win, right? So vote for me. And Hillary Clinton did a fair amount of that in the election. She really, we might, if we were really following, we could probably list some policies that she supported. But it's not even necessary that she had policies. Did she have a vision? What was her view of the mid-21st century of the United States? What is our role? What are we supposed to do? Who are we as a country? Obama used to, and especially in his first campaign, he spoke very articulately about us, who we are. But there was never any content to it. It was, oh, yes, we can. Can what? That's not who we are. Who are we? He would gesture in the direction of having an overarching vision, but it was kind of also, again, the empty set, like just kind of given. Just assume it's there, but not actually articulate what it is. And one of the reasons I think why he had trouble doing that, and anyone running today has trouble doing that, is that we are in this bimodal moment, or at least the early stages of a bimodal moment. And who are we? We're not one thing. We're two things, at least. We're many things. We're separate things. We're different nations who view the country and its history and who we should be very, very differently. And again, this is encouraged by negative partisanship, because as the people who are supposed to be articulating who we are have no incentive to actually try to say. The incentive is to say, well, whatever we are, we're not them. We don't want them to be in charge and to have power. So vote for me. And again, I really hit Clinton pretty hard in my commentary in the fall for this kind of vacuous statement that was all anti-Trump. Like she ran ad after ad after ad. There was nothing more than repeating the same things that we've seen Trump say in news coverage. So Clinton, people who say Clinton had unfair news coverage, yeah, they focus too much on her emails, fine. But the fact of the matter is, Trump had tons of coverage, but most of it, I mean, it was enough to make me hate his guts. Why wasn't it enough for more people to hate his guts? Well, the fact is, whatever you thought of Trump, you knew what he said, and you knew his defects or positive, whatever you liked him or not. You knew what he was. Nobody was in the dark about that. So why is the Clinton campaign running ad after ad after ad telling us that yet again? What's the message, Clinton? What do you want to do? Who are we instead of that? Didn't really have much to say. We're stronger together, she says. Okay, to do what? Again, not much. So these are these two trends, polarization and negative partisanship. In my writing, I often use the image of centrifugal forces. I've used this in many columns in our political culture. And this is another way of talking about reaction. Centrifugal force, which is not a real force, but you know what I mean. Something spins, and when something spins, stuff in the middle gets kind of pulled out to the edges. And that's the way our political culture is increasingly running, where the provocation, the reaction of one to the other, the fact that as the Republicans move further right, the left moves further left, the right moves even further left, right in response to that, and then the left moves further left in response to that, and on it goes. That's centrifugal forces coming into play. And it's, again, politically dangerous. It makes achieving any kind of national consensus on the common good increasingly difficult to achieve and maintain. It's also intellectually dangerous because it increases the reactive character of commentary, as I discussed earlier. And maintaining my equilibrium in this as a commentator is challenging, but I do my best. I'll just briefly sketch one way in which I try to understand some of what's going on beyond what I've said already. People say that it's amazing that Trump's approval is so low. It's historically low. He's been basically from May on, he's been around 38%. At the moment, it's going up a little because he made his sort of deal with Pelosi and Schumer. So that's kind of appealed to some people in the center and on the center left. And so he's ticking up. He's around, according to Nate Silver's website, who does aggregation of polls. So that means that his polling is much less volatile than other ones because he weighs all the polls and then tells us what they average out to be, with different weights on ones that are more reliable and less reliable. As of yesterday, Trump was around 39.4%, which is up from where he's been by about 1.4%. But historically, that's really low. For a new president to be down there is unusual. When I look at that, you know what my response is? My God, 37% of the country likes what we're seeing from this guy? That's a lot of people. That's more than 1/3 of all Americans not only tolerate it, but look at it and say, yeah, good job. And that I find very, very difficult to handle. And I could write column after column after column in which I just rant and rave about this, these deplorables, as Hillary Clinton called them. Oh, my God. But you know what? I said this in repeated columns throughout the fall last year, and I've said it in several columns since the election. The problem is this. That's a lot of people. That's tens of millions of people, and they're our fellow citizens. They're still here. They're not going anywhere. They have the vote. We have to figure out why this is happening and what it means. And, the answer might be really sort of scary. Plato talks in his great book, The Republic, about how forms of government and the souls of people who live under those governments mirror one another. So in a democracy, you end up with people with kind of democratic souls. Well, what does that mean? Well, in a democracy, everyone's vote is equal. We all have a say, right? Who are you to say? That's the most democratic thing you can ever utter, that phrase. Well, who are you to say? Well, I don't know. I think I'm right and you're wrong. Well, who are you to say that? I don't know. I think I'm wrong. Okay, I guess we can't say. I guess you get one vote, I get one vote. Okay. That's democracy at its essence. Well, Plato said that people who live in that kind of a government end up with a soul that's like that too. In other words, well, today I'm drawn to do this. This is my hobby. Well, that got boring. Well, now I'll do this. Oh, well, here's this third thing I'll do. Well, I think I'll change careers now and do this fourth thing. And we'll do that, and we'll go to work, and we'll go to church, and we'll have families, and we'll do this and that, and run all around, and we'll change careers 8 times before we die. And everything is kind of based on impulse with no passion given any weight above any other. You just kind of, as we say, go with the flow, or as they said in the 60s. Just kind of go wherever your spirit takes you, and it's all okay as long as no one gets hurt, with hurt defined in very brute physical terms. Sometimes on campuses in kind of psychological sense as well, but I won't go into that. Well, Plato also thought that tyrannies, authoritarian governments, tracked with the shape of souls under those forms of governments. So in other words, people who live under a despot, a dictator, would have souls that were apt to be ruled, who wanted to defer to authority and allow someone else to make the hard decisions, to applaud and say, yay, and be manipulated and give in to, I don't know, fake news and things like this. So I think a lot, and I've written a lot of columns about, are we evolving and not just us. I mean, it's happening throughout some of Eastern Europe and Hungary. They've begun to move a little in this direction. Poland's government, not quite as much, but there's evidence of some move in that direction. Turkey absolutely has moved in that direction. Putin, Russia, yeah, Trump likes him. Why is that? Well, one reason why is because they see the world kind of in the same way. Neither of them are Hitler. Hitler isn't the only bad guy that you could have. They're not all kind of demonic world historical monsters like Adolf Hitler. But Putin has not, he does not have a genuinely democratic bone in his body. He wants to get filthy rich, run things as he wants, and wants everybody else around him, all the people in Russia, to just kind of do what they're doing and leave him alone. Have fun, make money, watch the fake news, be distracted, and leave me alone to do what I want, to enrich myself and make myself more powerful. I do think that this gets at some aspect of a trend, whether it'll end up being fulfilled in a kind of end of American democracy as we've known it, or an evolution into a system that's actually 50% like Putinist dictatorship and still has some rudiments of American democracy. Maybe. But if that's the case, if that's a serious threat, we have to, again, understand why. Why is it that 38% of Americans find appealing this kind of a rule where the president lies frequently, retweets junk news that isn't news at all, that's a pure conspiracy theory, that anyone who has any awareness of reality and the way the world functions knows is just a lie, a kind of entertaining lie, perhaps, if it feeds their ideological prejudices. But it's almost as if they don't care very much. Let me give you one example of the way this can work out. You might remember a few years ago, a plane went down over Ukraine because it was shot down by anti-aircraft missiles on the ground. It was very high up, about 35,000 feet. But they fired at that tiny little plane up there and they hit it. You can only do that if you have very sophisticated weaponry and people who know how to use it. The weapons obviously came from Russia. It doesn't mean Russia ordered them to fire it. It probably was a couple of drunk idiots who did it, and they got lucky by hitting the plane. But this was a huge international scandal. It killed a few hundred people. Russia didn't want anyone to think they were involved. So what did they do? According to the normal, kind of the norms of disinformation, you would expect Putin to put out a story blaming someone else. It's them. They did it. It wasn't me. But actually, no, that's not what Russia did. What Russia did is they put out dozens of fake news stories, none of which was believable or plausible. So there was a story, leaked to this website and publicized saying something like what I said before, a couple of drunk lunatics on the tank or on the anti-aircraft gun did it. Another one blamed the United States. Another one blamed spies from the West. Another blamed the EU and so forth. Just on and on. Some of them, those are more plausible than some of them. They were ridiculous. Why? Flood the zone with nonsense. And if you do that, you know what's going to happen when you interview some person on the street and ask them how the plane fell down? You know what their answer is going to be? Hell if I know. There's no way to know. It's impossible. Who's to say? And I'm back then to the democracy point and the weird continuities between having democratic politics and a democratic soul and how that can be a bridge to a kind of dictatorial politics and a dictatorial soul. If you push the democratic soul's tendency to say, who's to say, I don't know, a little bit further, you end up with such cognitive intellectual chaos that no authority can have any status to adjudicate what the hell really happened. You won't believe anything. So if the EU comes out with a study definitively showing with hard evidence that it was a Russian anti-aircraft gun that brought down the plane, most people won't believe it. Well, of course the EU would say that. They hate Russia. They hate Putin. Screw them. And that's good enough for Putin. Trump wants, I think, intuitively, I don't think this is any kind of big strategy. He's not that sophisticated. But I think intuitively he is an expression of those tendencies and is working on it here. And obviously some significant faction of American voters find something appealing about this kind of politics as spectacle, politics as entertainment. So anyway, I guess I've been talking for almost 50 minutes now, so I'll wrap up. I mean, my point is simply that what I've been saying for the last 20 minutes or so is an example for you of, I think, what commentary can be that doesn't try to be simply reactive, simply reactionary in the sense that I defined it. What I'm saying is, I threw in some zingers, criticisms of Trump along the way, so you don't really have any doubt. I'm obviously not a Trump supporter. But by the same token, I never let it become simply that. It's kind of part of a process of trying to understand, and the understanding has to come first. It's a kind of exasperation, like, oh my God, I can't believe. In my ideal America, this guy would have like 2% approval. What are you talking about, 38%? That's incredibly high. That's a lot of people who like this. That scares me. I worry about my children's future. I worry about your future, what kind of a country you're going to be going out into. But it can't just be that. Screaming, ranting, raving, attacking, insulting the people who feel that way. Because if there is any hope of pulling them back toward a more responsible form of government, it has to be by trying to understand what is motivating them to like this and to give an alternative that might appeal to them. And even if that fails, at least let's go down trying to understand. That's what I guess I'll leave you with. So thanks.
Would you like to field your questions?
Absolutely. Sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I want to go back to your this last point that you made, and your talk kind of like a ebbed and flow, and I'm not really sure that I know what it means to be about. Like, how do I know that you're above the fray? Like, what's giving it out? Like, the fact that you're not using the word psychopath. It seems to me that the definition of being above the fray remains subjective to an extent that makes it a difficult heuristic to track, particularly because my understanding of what it might mean to be above the fray is probably very different from Aurelian's or anyone else in this room. And so that is my first question. But the second question is, let's assume that the fact that you're above the fray means that you're not using the word psychopath. But if you believe that this president is a psychopath, to the extent that you believe that it is absolutely insane that 39% of the population believes that they like what they're seeing, then what is the point of being above the fray? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the first question, I mean, I can't prove I'm above the fray. The only thing I guess I could say is I don't typically write to advance the agenda of any of the politically engaged factions on the scene. So what distinguishes what I do, I think, from, say, what John Chait does at New York Magazine is that he clearly is an Obama Democrat. He actually wrote a book that was very ill-timed, unfortunately for him, titled, I think it was just called Audacity. It was a kind of book that he wrote in the fall about Obama's presidency and the legacy of Obama and how it won't be undone, and he's changed America for the better. It was almost like a love note to Obama. Mwah, thanks, buddy. You really did good. Again, if Clinton had won, it would have seemed like a great send-off for Obama and a great transition to the Clinton presidency, the third year of Democratic rule, third cycle of Democratic rule. But instead, now it just looks like, it's not clear. It looks like Trump is dismantling a lot of what Obama did. And certainly if this new health care bill passes, it'll happen. But my point is that Chait usually is writing as an engaged, informed, smart, articulate Democrat. He is an establishment Democrat who is trying to advance the agenda of the Democratic Party. And a lot of people on the right are the same for the Republican Party. Whereas what I write sometimes takes that characteristic, but my goal is much more often to simply try to understand what's going on, which involves kind of, I don't know, they're all metaphors, so maybe it is all BS, but it's a metaphor of standing back a little bit, gaining perspective, trying to kind of judge what is each side doing in its own terms, not to trip one side and push the other forward, but simply to understand and observe, like, oh, isn't that interesting that the Democrats did this and the Republicans did that now? Why is that? It often involves talking in terms of how what one party does has an almost equal and opposite reaction to what the other party does. One thing I've also written a lot about is how we have, I sort of mentioned this, but a little bit different terms now, both parties are dealing with populist insurgencies right now. You've got Sanders and the people who support him among the Democrats against a kind of neoliberal establishment that is represented by the Clintons. And then on the right, you have kind of Trump and Bannon, with Trump inconsistently siding with Bannon and Breitbart and the nationalists, the populists. And then you have kind of Paul Ryan and the kind of what I call zombie Reaganism, kind of the ghost of Ronald Reagan, always looking to cut upper income taxes even more, always more cuts for rich people. Somehow that'll fix all problems if we only just cut taxes for the wealthy and cut regulation. So each party has its populist insurgency going on. And I think a lot of what we're living through and probably will determine the shape of the 2020 presidential election and maybe even the 2024 election is sorting out which party is going to become the populist party, because there's only room for one. Sanders and Trump on a certain way overlap in a way. So I'm getting beyond your question, but my It's not exactly the same. I would say if you look at what Bannon says, Bannon wants to raise taxes on the rich. He wants protectionism for American workers. He wants to basically stop. He's against war with North Korea. He said in an interview shortly before he left the White House that it's insane to talk about going to war with North Korea because Seoul is 30 miles from the border. Obviously, they know we can't attack the North because 10 minutes later, Seoul will be leveled. We'll have 2 million casualties, even if he doesn't use nukes. So it's not going to happen. So stop being so stupid and blustery. So all of those things are things that Sanders sometimes support: upper income tax, raising taxes on the wealthy. Sanders sometimes is sort of pro-protectionist. He's also talked at certain points about very strong benefits for American workers who he describes as citizens, implying that people who aren't citizens maybe wouldn't get as many benefits, which kind of sounds like a little of the immigration stuff. I'm not saying that Sanders is a xenophobe or anything, but there is some overlap between these two positions. Trump is inconsistent. Sometimes he talks like Bannon, sometimes he sounds like Paul Ryan. And so Trump is totally disjunctive, he's incoherent. But to get back to your original question, what I just described is an analysis that does not presuppose that I'm either a Democrat or a Republican. It doesn't tell you in and itself where I come down in that. Am I a neoliberal? Am I a Bannonite? Am I a Sanders supporter? That's kind of beside the point, because all I'm trying to do is explain what I think might be happening. So that's the best evidence I can offer to you. And what was the second question? I'll try to end it. All right, good. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very much enjoyed the talk. But I worry that you're conflating very different things in your political analysis, right?
Probably.
So one thing is intense partisanship, which you call negative partisanship. Intense partisanship is essential to democracy. If we don't like intense partisanship, we should move to Singapore, right? This is what democracy has to be about. So that per se cannot be the problem today. You're also talking about the emergence of ideologically coherent parties. Many thriving democracies, which we now have in this country. We didn't have previously. We shouldn't be nostalgic. I'm sure we agree about this, for a Democratic Party which had a racist, authoritarian wing, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of thriving democracies have had ideologically coherent parties. So I don't see how that could really explain the situation we're in, right? I think what you're getting at, and maybe I'm just rephrasing things you've said, is what is essentially an institutionally destructive kind of polarization, something going on whereby our institutions can't function, right? But the other things that I just mentioned, partisanship, ideologically coherent parties, they may be related to that, but they may not be, all right? But once you focus on this last thing, it seems to me you can open the door to the kind of conversation I think Federica just opened the door to, right? We could talk about, are in fact these two parties, is in fact the radicalization on the right and the left, is that somehow equivalent? Is that what's happening or not? I mean, I just don't think calling Bernie Sanders a populist, in a way that we can talk about Trump as a populist. Bernie Sanders is a European social democrat. That may be a novelty in American politics, but he's not an authoritarian populist. These are different things. That might be an analysis. I don't want to endorse that. I mean, although you can hear that I'd be sympathetic to it. Another analysis would be about our system. We have this crazy, 18th century system with 1 million veto points, which allows extreme, well-organized minorities to go and screw things up, and that creates all kinds. So anyhow, we could tell stories about that, but I don't think we should be. Partisanship's not the problem. Ideological parties are not the problem. We need to have a conversation about specifically why the polarization that we're seeing, that we're all worried about, is somehow dysfunctional. Dysfunctional in the sense that stuff doesn't get done. When it gets done, like some of the Obamacare. There is such hatred of what's happened that somehow this becomes explosive. I mean, that's really, it seems to me, what we have to worry about.
No, I agree with a lot of what you said. I couldn't get into everything in this, just as I can't in any one column, or even in sometimes 10 columns. Partisanship is good. Well, I would say it can be. I mean, some partisanship is inevitable, and it isn't bad. I said partisanship isn't bad. It's not shameful. But it's also the case that negative partisanship, I think, is destructive for the way that I described, because it does enable a party. Fox News, for instance, is an entire news network that exists to make Democrats and liberals look bad. Does it defend a coherent alternative? Sometimes, usually when there's a Republican in the White House, they kind of just fall in behind whatever the Republican administration is trying to accomplish and defend it. But it mainly exists to make the other side look terrible, which has that consequence that I described earlier, where it enables your own party to not have a positive vision because all it needs is to make the other one look worse. And that's how I've said. I wrote a column a few weeks ago that Trump could win re-election even at 38% approval. Because if he has 38%, all he needs is to get 10 more percentage points, roughly, based on negative partisanship. Just make whoever the Democrat nominee is, make that person look worse. And that's a function of the negative part of partisanship. When you get into ideological pure parties, that's a bigger issue that has to do, you're right, that it has to do with how it interacts with our institutions. And here I think we do have a real problem with ideologically pure parties, given that we have winner-take-all, single district voting districts combined with a presidential system. I mean, this is not a good mix. Political scientist Juan Linz wrote a lot about this and its role in the collapse of democracies in Latin America. When you have that combination of institutions with ideological purity, it's very volatile and dangerous in a way that it isn't in a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system where you have multi-parties, you could actually have, I talked a minute ago in response to you about how each party is fighting over which will be the populist party. We can't have more than two parties in our system. It just doesn't work. If you have three parties for an election cycle or two, what will happen is one side will divide the vote and then the opposite side will win. And eventually they get sorted out and you end up with another two parties with a realignment within them. In a parliamentary system, you could have a center-right party, a center-left party, a right-wing Bannonite party, and a left-wing Social Democratic Party. You could have all four, and then you would have a coalition formed with whichever ones win the most votes. And some would get some power and others wouldn't. Maybe the Bannonites would get the Labor Department. Maybe you'd throw a bone and give Health and Human Services to a kind of religious right party if it were a right-wing government. But then you'd also have to make more sensible people in charge of other ministries. You would be forced to compromise more and actually give more of a voice to some of these different positions, where in our system, it's always that only one of them is going to win 100% in any district. Yeah. The problem is that if we ever held a constitutional convention, it would be our psycho-political culture that would be the ones actually rewriting things, which scares me to death. Because all these factors that I've been talking about, like Fox and other things, would be there trying to have a say in how we fix things. I'm just not, I'm not someone who bows down and worships at the feet of the founders. But by the same token, they were far wiser than we are, and their political culture was far healthier than ours, precisely by being less democratic and less media. And it was basically just a room full of about this many people who were really well-read and made all the decisions. And that might not be democratic, but it works really well if your point is to just create a constitution that'll survive for a while. If we open it up to 320 million people with Twitter and lobbyists and stuff, it's going to be a total mess. Where's the mic? Is it over here? Pass the mic around.
Well, my question kind of builds on what Bill just asked, and I pass this on later. I have a real problem getting past the assumption at the beginning of your talk that critique or reaction is necessarily partisan. I think that actually may be at the core of what's the issue here, and it's something that it's been a very one-sided problem with American politics. It's created this false equivalency that somehow that respectable positions exist, and therefore one has to account the part in whatever whole that one looks at. That makes discussion about politics, and I don't, excuse me if I'm being a little indelicate here, very surface level when we toss out labels like populist or use people without actually discussing the substance. I object absolutely to the depiction of Hillary Clinton that you just painted. In the debates, she was so substantive in her campaign speeches. She talked about how the Trump presidency and Republican Party actually stand opposed to the bedrock liberal democratic values of equal respect for persons. She linked this to constitutional traditions in American public. She tried to evoke arguments by Republicans of yesteryear who would uphold these values that this fellow was walking right over. And she was kind of classified as just representing a left-wing, view to appease Bernie supporters, et cetera. Why? because this space has been created where there's always another side, and everyone has to kind of account this other perspective in it. And if anyone goes and defends a particular democratic principle, is necessarily a partisan. Critique is not necessarily partisan. Reflective, engaged dialogue that I think we were treated to by Clinton. I don't think she was vacuous. I don't think she was empty. It was not partisanship. I mean, Barack Obama for 8 years sounded like a Republican and couldn't even get a Supreme Court nominee. Why? Because somehow he had contributed to polarization of American politics because he didn't say what he meant by yes we can. Yeah, absolutely he did. I mean, look at the substance of the laws that are being reversed right now because he was very substantive about how he wanted to extend the franchise to people on the margins, and he did that. So and now everything is being his presidency's trying to be erased by pushing out critique and classifying it somehow as the other perspective that really doesn't take into account respectable, reasonable views. If anything, I think the last 9 months has made me a Rawlsian, thinking that we should have reasonable lines of discourse. That there is such a thing as unreasonableness in politics that us liberal Democrats really have ceded to the right. It's as that simple. It's that ideological battle that you talked about that is very much worth actually fighting in a partisan way that we've kind of very nicely walked around. So
well, I mean, I don't know exactly what I would disagree with or not in what you said. I don't see how. I don't know. Your Rawls comment kind of threw me for a loop because I don't see Rawls. I think see Rawls as trying to create a kind of space of neutrality where you're not that partisan, where we all just kind of agree about the basic questions and then it's all kind of problem solving. That we kind of. So you just want to take those 38% and say, get the hell out?
No, I don't want to say that. I want to say this is what you're endorsing. To have that substantive conversation and not sort of say what you just said.
Right.
To say, I'm saying I want to throw out 38%. That's the part that makes this into some sort of reactionary position I just adopted.
But then what are you saying? What
I'm saying is that when respect for persons is not held up by someone who's running for office, this is not something that should be up for debate as I want to erase 38% of people's preferences. I am questioning that preference at a substantive level, and we should have that conversation as opposed to me saying I want to throw out 38% of the people. I want to erase them out of this thing. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that introduces a part that makes me sound like a reactionary, where I'm the one who's trying to make this about the substance of our democratic system.
But what if you're Hillary Clinton and you're up against a candidate you think who doesn't believe in equal treatment? It's Trump. Trump doesn't. Your opponent does not hold to those Rawlsian principles. So that means on Rawlsian terms that he's not even really engaging in legitimate politics at all. So what do? You just say you're not doing it right? I mean, I don't understand what. Then you need a kind of meta-level politics in which we try to adjudicate that question. Like, can you have politics where one of the two parties isn't agreeing to the rules of the game? So what are the rules of the game by which we do that? Right.
What I'm saying is that the reason why she's written as more terrible is because of this attitude of, rather than discussing substantive democratic principles, we have to make this about, the inclusion or the exclusion of reactionary responses in our politics. That's not the issue here. The issue here is that the reason why she's disliked, there's a 30-year project going on to make these false equivalencies about what our everyday policy debates are ultimately about. They've been turned into these sort of highly personalized, the Clinton wing, the Bernie wing. I mean, you evoke all the kind of catchphrases that populate our contemporary vocabulary about politics, and none of it touches on what is actually being discussed here. And when someone does raise them, as Hillary did time and again throughout this campaign, it always gets classified as somehow, that this is someone who's vacuous and didn't say anything of substance. Her campaign slogans kind of attest to that.
Well, I'll step back from the way you're portraying some of that to simply say that I don't see as the same what I said about the people in the campaign. So you could disagree with what I said about Clinton. I'm not holding her to the same standard that I hold myself. Like when I talked in my remarks about trying to get beyond being reactionary, that was me as a commentator striving for that. I'm not saying that our politics should be run that way. I mean that there is a separate issue about how much, given our institutions that we play in and that set the parameters for our public life, how much partisanship is good for that and how much isn't, what kind of partisanship is good for that, ideological, negative, and so forth. And we can debate that. And then we can debate whether and to what extent the outcome of the last election was the result of one or the two of them not doing it right. But my point about the kind of perniciousness of reactionary takes, if you will, or responses or interpretations, is about my own work as someone trying to make sense of all of this. And so I don't think that a Democrat or a Republican should portray themselves as above the fray. And actually, I think I'm not going to blame this on Obama, because I'm aware of all of what you say and the way that the right has kind of, made a point for 8 years of demonizing him in a way that was largely very unfair. But Obama had that. He tried to portray himself as above the fray, as kind of like, I'm somehow not partisan. I'm just kind of, it was an outgrowth of a sort of small r Republican ethic of standing for the common good and kind of virtue as a political actor, that he was supposed to sort of be above the kind of nastiness of politics. And the right wouldn't let him get away with it, because any time he would say something that sounded like a partisan jab or kind of negotiate in a tough way with Republicans, they would say, look, see, he's a hypocrite. He's actually just the most ruthless Democrat of all, because he refuses to admit that he's a ruthless Democrat. Damn, he drives us crazy. And so that, I actually think that in some ways maybe he would have been better off if he had played harder ball with Congress in some of their negotiations over the budget in 2010 and 11. I know a lot of liberals who think that way, that he should not have given as much away to the Congress, to Boehner, in negotiations over the budget and so forth, and in ways that in the end he failed anyway, because it didn't work. They didn't accept it. And, that's a complicated question of then what the heck do you do? And I don't have a good answer to that.
I have the mic. Hi, Damon. It's Jeff Isaac. Nice to meet you.
Yes.
I enjoy your writing, and I enjoyed your talk. I have a different kind of question, actually.
Yeah.
I think all these questions are related, but I don't want to press you on. I agree with everything Huss said, but I don't want to press you on your account of contemporary American politics. Maybe we can come back to that. I want to ask you a question about how you began the talk, which is your self-understanding as a journalist, a commentator, and writer. So, and it's a kind of I have a kind of political theory question, and it's very straightforward. So, the 19th century was the age of mass politics, the beginnings of mass literacy, and the 20th century was the age of mass media. Mm-hmm. We're in the 21st century. Let's just say we're in an age of kind of post-modern communication, digital communication, etc. And you began, in fact, by, and some of your talk, in talking about the effects of kind of soundbite communication, etc., you're interested in what it means to intervene in this kind of a communicative environment, which is very different than the environment of the 1930s or the 1910s or 1890 when the populists thrived in the United States, the Populist Party. So my question is this. You began by saying that you had three models Aristotle, who was like, what, 2,500 years ago? How many years ago? Thucydides, who was, let's just say...
The same.
Yeah. And then Tocqueville.
Yeah.
Who was also like, what, 150 years ago?
Yeah, more.
Yeah, right. Okay, exactly. All of whom predated modern mass literacy, modern public education, modern mass communication, and the rise of, in fact, even what Habermas, I think, would call a modern public sphere. How do you make sense of that? I find it odd that you are writing 3 times a week for The Week, which I'm reading online. You're tweeting. You're talking about what it means to function in this communicative environment, which I think has something to do with the rise of someone like Trump, as you say, and that your models are Aristotle, Thucydides, and Tocqueville. And I actually wonder whether there's some connection between that and the kind of pseudo-moderation that you're extolling that a lot of people are having problems with. But that's a suggestion. My question is, how do you make sense of that? How could those 3 be your models in this world? Yes.
Pseudo moderation to you, buddy.
Yeah. True of him too, by the way.
Well, I don't even know how to answer that question because it seems obvious to me. This obviously comes out of my own prejudices and kind of formation in political theory. Is that the best thing you can do in trying to understand is to try to gain distance or perspective. And that can happen in many ways. It can happen by, when you travel abroad. So you could travel abroad and try to understand the country you're now living in, learn its political system, and you might notice things that people who live in it don't see. Or you could just go away for a while and then come back, and then you look at your own country and are like, wow, I never noticed that because I got out of it and I stopped seeing that. And now I'm back and suddenly something is showing up that I took for granted. It was the background. Now it's there and I realize, wow, this other country I was just in doesn't do it that way. That's weird. Why do Americans do that? So that's one way to do it, physical traveling through space. But the other way to do it is through a kind of imaginative reading of the past and smart people from the past. And if I bring a sensibility that is informed by reading those 3 old dead white men, it might bring a perspective to 21st century America that a lot of people who live within it don't have, simply by kind of having these different frames that I get from those thinkers. Like, oh, I didn't realize, like, oh, actually what's going on isn't that different than what Thucydides says in this passage or what Aristotle says or Tocqueville says. Like, it can let me see things that I might not see if I just lived immersed in the peculiarities of this moment.
Let me press you because my point wasn't a point about dead white male. My point, and I'm all in favor of reading those dead white males, especially as a political theorist. I even sometimes teach them. You're a journalist and you're talking about your engagement in the public sphere of the 21st century. And you're saying that your models are 3 long dead people who had nothing to do with the modern communicative public sphere at all. And I find that odd. Let me go back to Aurelian, who I have lots of problems with. So Aurelian's book, which you know well because you published it, is about 20th century public intellectuals. When you first started thinking, I wrote on my page, Aron, the committed observer, Aurelian loves this idea. Aron lived in the middle of the 20th century in a context much closer to our own than Thucydides or Tocqueville. I can understand a journalist today who says my models are wrong. I thought you were going to mention Orwell. I can understand. I'm not critiquing. Your models are your models. It is very strange and paradoxical that you are a 21st century digital commentator trying to stake out a position in this incredibly fucked up world in which bad forms of populism are being intensified by the forms of communication that you are participating in, like Twitter. And you're telling us that your models are people who lived in a world that was totally unlike it.
Well, let me clarify. When I said those 3 people, I meant only about the point I made, about trying to get distance on politics. and kind of look at it from an outsider's perspective to see things that you might not otherwise see. Those are not my intellectual models in other respects. I mean, I've learned a lot from all of them, but I also am very influenced by Isaiah Berlin, Daniel Bell. There are other, and Raymond Aron, although not as much. I mean, so I have many models, including my teacher Mark Lilla, who you're a big fan of. I have many. I don't model my columns on Aristotle in the sense that I try to pretend I'm Aristotle in 2017. I only meant it in that one respect that I brought them up in this case. If I were doing an autobiographical lecture, I would have mentioned all kinds of other people. Leo Strauss too, who also has influenced me in a whole bunch of ways. But you wouldn't necessarily guess that, given that he's usually placed on the right, and most of the people who he influenced are conservatives, and certainly don't support the center left as I tend to these days. So I'm a slippery, complicated guy.
To be clear, Damon, we're not all right-wing Straussians. There are some of us who are not all.
Yes, a couple. You, me, Bill Galston, 3 or 4. Yeah.
But in the sort of thing about how Tocqueville says, I saw in America more than America, I saw the image of democracy, right? I mean, it strikes me that you're trying to do something about that, about the partisanship you're witnessing. And so I want to ask you a question about whether that mode, whether you see it as having some sort of effect on the negative partisanship you're seeing, and the question of here are 34% of the American public who have voted for something for a variety of reasons that you and many of us would deem as, just completely beyond the pale. Do you see your mode of engagement, your mode of analysis, your columns, as having some sort of effect on both of those things, meaning not to the 66 other percent, but to that 34 as well?
I'm not sure. Probably not. I mean, I have no illusions about the influence that my writing has. I mean, I'm not even if I were in the New York Times and had that huge readership. I mean, how much does a pundit change the world? Not much. I mainly write, for a paycheck, but I mainly write for myself. I write to understand. And sometimes just because I have a deadline and I have to write. If I can have some marginal, minimal influence on a handful of readers, that's nice, but I don't presume that I do. My main goal is to understand what's going on, I guess I would say. So strangely, I guess you could say I don't so much have a kind of public-spirited goal in mind, simply because I'm very aware of the limitations that someone like me can have in a country of 320 million people, many of whom don't really care much about politics and don't read about it and so forth. So I guess that's my inadequate answer. Thank you. Thanks for having me.